They called it a patrol. 2 days to cross a shallow valley and return. But the line between departure and return is fragile when the forest decides to erase it. November 1944. The Battle of Hürtgen had already become synonymous with slow advances and constant losses. On the map, the region looked small. On the ground, it was a damp labyrinth where the cold pressed into the bones and the horizon vanished under a locked canopy. Alpha 9 of the U.S. 28th Infantry Division entered carrying gear, discipline, and orders. The last time they spoke was at 03:14. A burst of static, a voice fractured mid-sentence.
We not follow, trails change.
Then only absence. The Hürtgen forest straddles the border between Germany and Belgium, but its geography was never merely political. Narrow ravines, uneven slopes, and a dense lattice of pines formed a natural barrier. Winter crept in early, coating the ground in a thin, treacherous frost. German mines hidden beneath dead leaves turned the undergrowth into a trap. Sound vanished quickly, swallowed by timber and fog. Communications failed without warning. Maps rushed into print led patrols to clearings that didn't exist or to paths ending in sheer rock walls. Alpha 9 moved out before dawn. The captain remained behind to coordinate other operations, while 9 men descended into the valley. They crossed narrow streams, feeling the weight of silence grow heavier with each hour. By the second night, there were no distant gunshots, no echo of other footsteps, only the internal noise of their own bodies, breath, heartbeat. It was in that silence the radio came alive. The voice was familiar, but altered as if speaking from somewhere deeper than the static. It spoke of trails that had changed, of routes that no longer matched memory. The search teams followed the points marked the day before, and nothing matched. Narrow tracks ended at hidden cliffs. Open passages closed into knots of branches and thorn. In some stretches, men swore the air shifted, as though they'd crossed into another place without noticing. The smell changed too, first wet soil, then something mineral and cold, like freshly broken stone. After 3 days, the search was ended. On paper, they were presumed dead. Among those who heard the story, another version endured. Alpha 9 hadn't fallen in combat. Alpha 9 had vanished into the forest, and whatever rules that place never gives back what it takes. At first, the search for Alpha 9 was conducted with the same brisk efficiency as any wartime recovery. Orders were clear, the objective simple: follow the recorded route, locate the missing squad, and bring them back, or what was left of them. Yet, within hours of stepping into the valley, the rescuers began to sense that the task would not unfold according to protocol. Landmarks carefully noted in the original patrol logs were absent. A fallen pine beside a narrow stream, a ridge described as shaped like a blunt knife, neither could be found. Coordinates transmitted by the missing squad's own radio equipment led instead to slopes none of the maps displayed, to gullies that should not have existed. The fog was dense, yes, and the war had a way of altering the landscape. But there was something else here, something not accounted for in the doctrine of search and rescue. The men didn't just fail to find Alpha 9, they failed to find the places Alpha 9 had been. As the search pushed deeper, the maps they carried lost their authority. Trails sketched in neat pencil lines curved back unexpectedly, delivering the men to places they had already crossed hours before. New forks appeared where none had been marked, splitting into paths that vanished into undergrowth so thick it choked the light from above. Compasses grew uncertain, their needles wavering not between points on the horizon, but between something that felt like here and not here. The radio sets hissed and crackled, but no voices came through, only the mechanical breathing of static. These were not green recruits. They were soldiers hardened by months of navigating ruined villages, bombed roads, and unfamiliar cities under fire. Yet here, in the heart of the forest, their instincts faltered. At the threshold of each clearing, they hesitated, unable to decide if the ground ahead was new territory or the echo of somewhere they had already stood. Some began to report sensations they could not fully name, a creeping awareness that they were moving in circles without repeating any single step. It was not as though they had turned back, rather the ground itself seemed to have turned beneath them. Small streams were found flowing in directions opposite to those on the maps. Rises in the terrain sloped differently from one pass to the next. The trees, tall and patient, seemed to shift their alignment, closing like ranks before an unseen commander. One sergeant, who had fought in the mountains of Italy, muttered to no one in particular that at least in the mountains the land stayed still. Here, he said, the land was alive. It was not panic that took them. These were men accustomed to battle, but something slower, more corrosive, the steady erosion of certainty, the quiet dissolution of the soldier's most reliable weapon, his sense of where he stood. The forest became not a setting, but an adversary. The sound of their own boots dulled, swallowed by the damp earth. Distances stretched until 100 meters could not be trusted to feel like 100 meters. The air pressed close, heavy in the lungs, carrying the faint tang of wet stone and something sharper, colder, without name. Underfoot, their tracks faded faster than seemed natural, as though the soil had no interest in keeping their record. In one particularly narrow stretch, where the trees leaned inward as if in conference, a corporal scanning the tree line whispered to his companion, "It doesn't end." It was not exaggeration. His eyes moved along the lines of trunks into shadow, and each gap between them gave way to more trees, more shadow, more paths that beckoned outward but led nowhere. By the third day, the word infinite had entered the whispered lexicon of the search teams. It was not meant as poetry. The forest seemed capable of swallowing direction itself, bending space into loops so that there was no center, no edge. One team, convinced they had broken into new ground, returned to camp to find their own boot prints waiting for them. The official report would later call it navigational disorientation under adverse environmental conditions. It was a phrase designed for file cabinets and military archives. But for the men who had walked those shifting trails, the truth was far less orderly. The Hürtgen was not merely vast, it had no measure. And whatever it had claimed, it did not intend to give back. In 1979, the forest gave up something. Not a body, not a weapon, but a fragment of story. A local historian, combing the edge of a long-forgotten trench, uncovered a rusted M1 helmet half buried in the soil. Inside, wrapped in a piece of rotted military cloth and sealed by decades of damp earth, was a small field diary. The cover had warped, the spine swollen, but the pages inside were still legible in places. The handwriting was uneven, letters leaning into one another as if written in haste or with trembling hands. The entries began with mundane notes, weather reports, short descriptions of terrain. But as the pages turned, the language shifted. Sentences fractured. The descriptions grew uncertain, filled with questions. Then came the first mention of orders received from a voice, orders given in the unmistakable tone of their captain who had not been with them in the valley. The voice, the diary claimed, called them off their route. It led them into narrow passes, across streams they did not recognize, toward ridges that rose and vanished like smoke. Paths appeared, clear as roads, only to end in sheer drops or fold back into the same clearing they had just left. The writer described moments when the squad argued quietly, unwilling to disobey a command they believed authentic but unsettled by its origin. In one passage, the ink had smeared, the words nearly illegible. We follow, but the ground changes. Every step is new. Days bled together in the narrative. Meals were skipped without notice. The forest, he wrote, had a rhythm, one that did not match the sun. Time inside it was not the same as time outside. Near the end of the diary, the tone shifted again. The handwriting became erratic, the lines slanting wildly across the page. The voice now gave no destination, only instructions: turn left, cross the water, keep moving. The squad obeyed because to stop felt dangerous, though the danger had no shape. There was a growing sense of being shadowed. The writer described hearing boots behind them, always at the same distance, never closer, never farther. Yet whenever they turned, the trail was empty. Not ours, he wrote, not the enemy, but it walks when we walk. Then abruptly, the final pages ended mid-sentence. The very last sheet had been torn out, leaving only the ragged edge of paper clinging to the spine. The helmet, the diary, and the cloth were turned over to authorities. The official archive entry recorded them as recovered personal effects, unverified origin. The forest closed over the trench again. Those who handled the diary spoke of the faint smell it carried, not of mold, but of wet stone and metal. In the years that followed, stories of the voice in the valley spread among locals, woven into older legends of the Reviergeist, the guardian spirit said to lead intruders astray. Some believed the voice was a trick of the enemy, others that it was the forest itself, speaking through the memory of the captain to draw the men deeper. But the diary offered no answer. It ended, like the patrol, on a trail that went nowhere.
Long before the Battle of Hürtgen, the forest had already earned its reputation as a place that did not give back what it took. Villagers in the surrounding hills spoke of hunters who set out before dawn and never returned, of travelers whose horses wandered home without riders. Parish records from the 17th century note entire search parties that disappeared as thoroughly as those they sought. The missing were rarely found, and when they were, they often carried no memory of where they had been. The forest's silence was not seen as peaceful. It was described as a weight, a presence that pressed in from all sides. These were stories told in winter by firelight, in a tone that suggested they were less superstition than lived experience. By the time soldiers marched into Hürtgen in 1944, its reputation among locals was already fixed. The forest was older than the war, older than the villages, and it had its own rules of its own. One of the most enduring legends spoke of the Reviergeist, the guardian spirit of the forest, neither wholly benevolent nor entirely hostile. In old accounts, it appeared not as a figure, but as a voice, often one the listener recognized. Hunters claimed it spoke in the tone of a long-dead friend or a missing family member, urging them to take a different path. Those who obeyed rarely returned, and if they did, they emerged from the trees days or weeks later than expected, unable to explain the missing time. In some tellings, the Reviergeist was a remnant of ancient forest worship, a spirit tasked with defending the land against intruders. In others, it was simply the forest itself, aware and willful, able to twist space and memory to suit its ends. These stories were not widely shared with outsiders. They were for locals, for those who understood that the forest could not be entered lightly. There were wartime echoes of the legend as well. In 1914, during the first months of World War I, German soldiers posted near Hürtgen recorded strange night marches in their journals, long patrols in which they circled back to their own camp without realizing it. Some reported hearing their commanding officer giving orders from ahead, only to find him asleep in his tent. The incidents were quietly dismissed as fatigue or misnavigation, but among the older soldiers, the term Revergeist patrol became shorthand for any mission where the land seemed to lead you rather than the other way around. The similarities to Alpha 9's last radio transmission in 1944 were difficult to ignore. The sense of following orders, the sudden disorientation, the trails that led nowhere. Even the official geography of the forest seemed unstable. Historical maps from the 19th century name clearings, streams, and ridges that no longer appear in any survey. Locals referred to them as the lost names, claiming these places had been taken by the forest and no longer existed for those who did not already know them. In some versions of the story, the forest would only open these places for certain people at certain times. In others, they were gone entirely, erased from both land and memory. This toponymic vanishing, as a modern folklorist called it, was often linked to disappearances. Villagers said that once a name was gone from the map, it was only a matter of time before someone followed it into the dark. Perhaps the most unsettling connection to Alpha 9 came from a date written in both parish records and oral tradition. In 1823, a group of woodcutters was reported missing after venturing into the Hürtgen to harvest timber. They were last seen on the morning of November 17th, the same date Alpha 9 entered the valley in 1944. The woodcutters' bodies were never recovered, and their tools were found years later in a place no map could locate. For those who keep the old stories, the repetition of that date is not coincidence, but pattern. The forest, they say, remembers. It keeps its own calendar, and every so often, on days only it marks, it takes what it believes is owed.
The first testimony to surface after the war came from Hans Becker, a German civilian who had lived in a small farmstead near the edge of the forest. In a 1946 interview with Allied investigators, he claimed to have seen men in uniform marching in circles deep within the trees, sometime in late November 1944. They moved in silence, their weapons slung, their faces expressionless. Becker watched them from a distance for what felt like hours, but they never seemed to progress. Always the same place, he said. They walked, but they did not go. The report was archived under civilian sightings and never pursued. Officially, Becker's account was dismissed as misinterpretation, perhaps of lost units regrouping. Unofficially, it became one of the first civilian confirmations that Alpha 9 might have been seen alive after their disappearance. Cartographic evidence added another layer of unease. Aerial reconnaissance photos from 1944, compared to maps produced in the late 1960s, showed subtle but undeniable changes in the valley's topography. A ridgeline appeared where a depression had once been. A stream had shifted course by several meters, despite no recorded flooding or seismic activity. The official explanation cited natural erosion and forest growth, but geologists later pointed out that the changes did not match normal erosion patterns for the region. It was as if the land had been rearranged wholesale, with no evidence of the forces that should have caused it. Among researchers of wartime anomalies, the Hürtgen maps became a quiet obsession, a rare case where changes in the terrain seemed to corroborate folklore. The diary recovered in 1979 contained one of the more chilling pieces of evidence: repeated mentions of footsteps behind us that matched their own pace. The writer insisted these were not echoes. The sound was too distinct, too deliberate. Whenever the squad halted, the footsteps ceased instantly. Whenever they moved again, so did the unseen follower. He described once turning sharply to catch a glimpse, only to see empty ground. This account aligns with at least 2 modern testimonies from hikers in the same sector of the forest who, decades later, reported identical sensations of being shadowed, though alone. In each case, the follower remained invisible, leaving no prints. The phenomenon has been called the parallel march by some researchers, a name that has since become part of the Hürtgen's unofficial lexicon. One of the more tantalizing clues is the so-called lost photograph. Filed originally in a U.S. Army archive, it was taken during a post-war survey of the valley. In the background, barely discernible through the mist, is a faint human silhouette, too indistinct to identify, but standing in an open clearing where no personnel were recorded as present. The photograph was removed from circulation in 1983 without explanation. A copy exists in a private collection, but the image quality is degraded, the figure now little more than a blurred suggestion. Those who have examined the original describe the posture as rigid, military, and oddly anachronistic, as if the subject were dressed in gear no longer standard even in 1944. Modern expeditions into the valley have produced their own anomalies. Hikers and amateur explorers equipped with GPS devices report sudden loss of signal in specific pockets of the forest, often accompanied by compass malfunction. More disturbingly, several teams describe walking for hours only to find themselves back at their starting point without conscious turning. These accounts are consistent enough to be recognized by locals who avoid the area altogether. For them, the Hürtgen is not a battlefield to be explored, but a boundary to be respected. And for those who still speak of Alpha 9, these modern glitches are not coincidence. They are proof that whatever happened in 1944 is still happening, the forest still capable of holding on to its secrets.
Within weeks of Alpha 9's disappearance, rumors began to circulate through the 28th Infantry Division. Officially, the squad was listed as missing in action, presumed dead in the confusion of the Hürtgen campaign. Unofficially, soldiers began to whisper about the ones trapped in the trees, men who were still marching somewhere inside the forest, cut off not by enemy fire, but by something unseen. Patrols assigned to the valley reported growing unease, and some quietly refused the duty altogether. The absence of bodies did little to help morale. In war, death is easier to accept when it can be confirmed. Here, there was no closure, only the possibility that the missing were neither alive nor dead, but held in a state no one could explain. The story spread beyond the division, passing into other units as a cautionary tale. The forest does not always let you leave. After the war, documents relating to the incident were classified under operational losses restricted and remained sealed for decades. In 1999, some were partially declassified, but entire sections were redacted, pages obscured with black ink. Among the released material were field reports describing the inability to match the valley's coordinates with existing maps, and handwritten notes from officers acknowledging persistent anomalies in navigation. One report contained a vague recommendation to avoid long-range patrols into the sector, except under urgent necessity. The language was careful, avoiding direct mention of supernatural causes, yet the tone was unusual for military correspondence, cautious, almost deferential toward the terrain itself. This reticence only deepened the legend. Official silence is often louder than denial. Psychological explanations were proposed in later years. Military historians suggested collective disorientation brought on by fatigue, stress, and prolonged exposure to the forest's uniform scenery. Psychologists pointed to spatial dissociation, a documented phenomenon in which the brain loses its ability to process direction after extended monotony. Yet these theories stumbled over the physical evidence, the altered maps, the consistent loss of GPS signal in modern times, and the independent accounts of footsteps that could not be traced. Stress does not move a stream, one researcher noted dryly, and it does not rearrange a ridgeline. The disconnect between rational explanation and tangible anomalies kept the story in a liminal space, never fully believed, never fully dismissed. In paranormal researchers, the Alpha 9 case became part of a broader theory involving so-called geographic convergence zones, places where magnetic fields, geology, and environmental conditions combine to distort human perception and perhaps even the passage of time. Similar reports exist from mountains in Asia, deserts in Africa, and tundra in the Arctic. In each, the common element is a sense of dislocation, as if space folds or stretches unpredictably. Some theorists link these zones to ancient sacred sites, suggesting they have long been recognized, if not understood. The Hürtgen's reputation among locals as a place with its own will fits neatly into this framework, though the idea remains far outside accepted science. The case of Alpha 9 is often cited as one of the most documented examples of such a phenomenon, with the diary serving as a rare inside account from within the zone itself. The last known twist in the case came in 2004, when skeletal remains were recovered in a section of the forest long inaccessible due to unexploded ordnance. The bones were clad in a U.S. Army uniform from the Second World War, insignia matching Alpha 9. Forensic analysis yielded an anomaly. The fabric of the uniform, though weathered, showed far less decay than expected for material left exposed for 60 years in a damp environment. Some fibers retained their weave almost perfectly. The finding was never publicly explained, and the remains were quietly interred in a military cemetery without ceremony. To those who follow the story, this final detail is the most haunting. Not that Alpha 9 died, but that something in the forest slowed their passing, as if time itself had been reluctant to let them go.
The Hürtgen forest remains today much as it did in 1944, dense, quiet, and unwilling to yield its secrets. Those who visit expecting a preserved battlefield find something else entirely. A landscape that swallows sound, distorts distance, and carries a weight that is difficult to put into words. The memorials are few, the trails often unmarked. There are places where GPS fails and the compass drifts, where the trees seem to lean in close, as if to remind you that you are on borrowed ground. Standing in the valley where Alpha 9 vanished, one feels the absence as a physical thing, as if the air itself remembers. The official record ends with names etched into stone, but the forest's record is different. It is written in the way it changes, the way it hides. Over the decades, the story of Alpha 9 has shifted from military anecdote to something larger, something closer to folklore. Veterans speak with it the same tone they use for stories about comrades lost in battle, a mixture of respect and reluctance. Among locals, it has become a caution, a quiet reminder not to test the forest's patience. The details change in the retelling. Sometimes the voice is a trap, sometimes a guide, sometimes both. But the core remains. 9 men went in, and none returned. In war, such numbers are common. What is uncommon is the absence of a cause, the lack of finality. The story refuses to close, and in that refusal lies its power. What happened to Alpha 9 cannot be proved. Theories abound. Enemy deception, navigational failure, psychological breakdown, or something beyond human understanding. Yet each explanation leaves questions unanswered, details unaccounted for. Why the matching date with the 1823 woodcutters? Why the altered maps? Why the preservation of the uniform decades later? These are not the kind of inconsistencies that fade over time. They persist, gnawing at the edges of the official narrative. For some, this persistence is enough to keep the forest at a distance. For others, it is an invitation, the lure of a mystery that resists every attempt to solve it. In the end, the Hürtgen does what it has always done. It keeps what it wishes to keep. Whether Alpha 9 still marches somewhere inside its shifting trails, or whether they became part of the forest long ago, no one can say. Perhaps they rest, or perhaps they walk still, guided by a voice only they can hear. Standing at the edge of the trees, you might listen for it, a faint call carried through the branches, almost familiar, almost yours. And if you hear it, you will have a choice: follow or turn away. Just remember, the forest has no reason to let you go.